again, because it's taped, if anything comes up, if there's a noise or if you have to stop, if you don't like your answer, we'll stop, take a pause. I'll re ask the question.
Okay.
And by all means. I wanted to start with this. I wanted to go back and start, I guess, really at the beginning of your career, but please correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, you started your career, you were with Newsweek, you were in the Hong Kong Bureau, right?
Correct.
Tell
I
me a little bit about
that's
that.
that's when I started my print career. I
Okay.
actually started journalism in college at the University of Pittsburgh, and I couldn't afford to take an unpaid internship. And at the time, most newspaper internships were unpaid, and I just, even though I wanted to do print, I couldn't do it. And so I did a television internship at KDKA TV. I did two internships there, had great experiences, and it really clarified for me that I wasn't interested in television. And then in my sophomore year of undergraduate, I got a job on the weekends for a radio station. And so I really started, in terms of my skills, I would say in radio, running the board on Friday and Saturday on a 5 a.m. to 1 shift, which worked while I was in college. And I worked for Sheridan Broadcasting Network, which is now American Urban Radio Networks. I worked for them all through undergrad and through graduate school. And so radio helped get me through school. And back then, when dinosaurs roamed the earth and we cut audio with razor blades and tape, I could do everything that any job that needed to be done in a radio station by the time I finished my education. But my goal was to go into print, and I mastered in East Asian Studies with a focus on China, and I studied Mandarin Chinese and moved to Asia, and that's where I started working for Newsweek.
I do remember those days, by the way. I also started radio when we were cutting tape with razor
Yeah,
blades. So those were fun days, though.
yes.
The experience that you had in Hong Kong, how would you describe it? I mean, how did it help shape you as a journalist today?
Oh my gosh. I mean, in many ways, that was the best time of my career. One, just because I set a goal for myself and achieved it. And, at the time, I, I had a strong interest in China. I had I went to school in the late 80s, and Tiananmen Square had happened.
Mm.
And so, in the same way that 9/11 shaped many young journalists who were then suddenly interested in learning Arabic and learning about Islam and learning about different cultures, I think that Tiananmen Square in 1989 really shaped my interest in international news. And at the time, it wasn't like there were a large number of African American journalists studying China and wanting to work in China. And I think that's probably still the case. Um, but being able to go uh, and freelance and be a stringer, where you're really doing any work that comes up, and you're learning, one, how to navigate your way through another culture, which I think is essential. And in international bureaus, because they're so small, it was like working in that radio station. In some ways, you had to learn how to do everything. And so, not, I placed a lot of value on not starting at headquarters. I did work for Newsweek, and I did work for the New York Times, and I did work for NPR, but I think I really benefited from having started in the field, where the work was a bit scrappier and you had to really be on your toes a lot. And I think that working in Hong Kong in the late 90s, when there was such a big news story, because the handover of Hong Kong back to Chinese rule from Britain was happening in 1997. So it was unusual, because most global news stories that are large, all-encompassing stories tend to be breaking stories, like
Mm.
wars, like what we're seeing now. then that date, July 1st, 1997, was a day that everyone knew was coming for a long time. And so you had this large international story that everyone wanted to cover, but you could prepare for it. And so I arrived in Hong Kong in 1994 and was covering the run up to the handover, and then from there, was got to be part of Newsweek's team, got to cover Southeast Asia, um, and so I think that experience of covering international news really made me a better national journalist when I came back to the United States. And I just wouldn't trade that time for anything. I think it opened my eyes to so much of the world. And journalism is one of these professions. Sometimes people ask me if they need a degree in journalism. And, and it is something really that you learn best by doing.
Right.
And I was lucky to have great editors um, who were pretty tough, pretty
Mm.
tough, and really helped me learn the craft.
Was it so from Newsweek in Hong Kong? You came back to the United States, and is that then you went to the New York Times?
No, I came back in late 1998 to work in Newsweek's Washington bureau. And
Okay.
again, sort of, I have these major events that sort of that 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 I think framed my career in print. When I arrived back in the United States in August, September of 1998, um, it was the Clinton impeachment trials.
Mm.
And even though I had, done a lot of things in Southeast Asia, and I think kind of made my mark um, in the Hong Kong bureau. When I came to Washington, I hadn't been in the United States in 6 years. I was the very, 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 very junior person in a bureau working on a big story. And so when the whole office was abuzz um, with this Clinton impeachment scandal, and the Starr report came out. Kenneth Starr
Hmm.
did a very famous report that was back then. He released that report at a Kinko's a couple of blocks from the White House, and we had to be there standing outside the Kinko's to wait for the report to be handed to us. And so, because everyone else was extremely busy and I was the very low person on the totem pole in the bureau, my job was to go stand outside the Kinkos and get that report back to the office as fast as I could. And that report, if you remember, had all kinds of very salacious details in it about a stained dress and all manner of misdeeds. And I remember getting this report and flipping through it and calling back into the bureau and saying, "Oh my gosh, there's a cigar and there's a dress and there," and running it back to the bureau, and and that's how I started working as a Washington-based reporter.
Oh, that does bring back memories. And you know what? I mean, just as a thought, the one time I had an experience anything like that was I was in Denver. It was the year after Columbine, and the sheriff's department was finally releasing its report, and we were all standing outside of their office. And when they released it, it was just they wheeled out these 700-page plastic
Yes,
binders with CD-ROM. If anybody wants to remember what a CD-ROM is or know what it is, please Google that. But yeah, that was, here you go. Here's our report. Okay, thanks. And
you
then
didn't,
yeah,
we couldn't put things into a database and search for keywords, or you had to flip through and
oh
with a
yeah,
highlighter and a pen mark things up, um
the
and
the
but
good old days.
those were
The-
exciting days. And I also think that by that time I went to study in Taiwan, to study Chinese in Taiwan in 1992, and then from there moved to Hong Kong in 94, came back in 98. So by the time I came back to the United States, I'd been out of the country for 6 years, and then I became a national correspondent. and
Mhm.
And the other thing I would say about being an international reporter is that I do think it made me a better national correspondent because I didn't take anything for granted. I had questions about everything. And if it was an education story, I remember vouchers were really big in the news. And I was, what is a voucher? What is this? What are we talking about? You know, everything was very fresh. And so I didn't, I don't think I was coming with so many baked in assumptions about how things worked in the United States.
Mm,
And after being outside of the country, in some ways, reporting on the United States
mm.
felt like international reporting to
That's
me.
a, yeah, no,
Um,
that's an interesting take. I think yeah, I think sometimes we forget that. That is a really good point. Thank you for making that. Did you? I mean, was the transition though? Was it difficult because you immersed yourself in this other world and learning the language and the way of life there, which is I and look, I wouldn't know, you would know. It would just seem like it's so different. But was that a big transition for you when you came back?
it was a big transition in a lot of ways. I mean, you know, I felt that I remember feeling that Washington was a very parochial place, very myopic, and everyone thought every turn of the screw was so very important. Um, and it, and I guess I was approaching things where I didn't think the things that people thought were so consequential were as consequential in the grand scheme of things in the
Mm,
world. And so I think in that way it was a bit difficult to adjust, but it was also very exciting. And I think that was a time, several years before the iPhone came out, and when news magazines still had a sort of distinct role to play. I loved the weekly news magazine. I think actually I would love to see the weekly news magazine make some sort of a comeback. I think there's an argument to be made um, that we actually need a weekly news magazine, a really strong weekly news magazine now, because we're so flooded with information
hmm.
and it's coming at us every second. And and there's not, I loved that function of being able to step back and say, what happened last week? Here's
Yeah.
let us slow things down and tell you what happened and why you should care about it. um, and everything just moves like a bullet train now. um, and I think there's tremendous journalism happening, but it's all coming so fast, and I think sometimes we lose that perspective. And so I appreciated the time to think skeptically about things that were happening and to write about them and on a slightly slower cycle, on a weekly
Mm.
cycle instead of a minute by minute cycle.
When did you? It was you were the founding editor, right? Of the
Of the
Root.
root.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about that and that experience.
Yeah, so I went from Newsweek to the New York Times in the spring of 2002, and I worked for the New York Times out of the Washington bureau and was a national correspondent. And I covered politics and social issues and demographics and national trends. And then the very short version of the story was that, Newsweek at the time was owned by the Graham family that owned the Washington Post. It was owned by the Washington Post company. And so I had worked for the Washington Post company by being a member of Newsweek, and then I went to the New York Times. And in 2007, the Washington Post company came back to me and said that they wanted to try to start a website that was focused at an African American audience interested in politics. And At the time, I most of my job switches, I think I've been lucky in this respect, have not been because I've been unhappy at a place. They've been because there was some other opportunity that I felt would teach me something I needed to know about where journalism was headed.
Mm,
And at the time, it was very clear that digital was becoming where things were moving, and the big newspapers were hiring digital staff, but they were sort of cordoned off in a separate part of the company. So though I was working for the New York Times, I wasn't really learning those digital skills. They were hiring new people to do that. And um, again, for going back to the beginning of my background, I was never somebody who could afford to take a free internship. I also was not somebody who could, at that point in my career, afford to be bought out, because I
mm,
didn't know the skills of the future. And then all of a sudden find that I somehow wasn't a journalist anymore. And so I felt like maybe the way to learn digital was just to go and learn it and work on a startup. And I was very naive about it, but I just took a jump, and this was a project that Don Graham, who was the head of the Washington Post company, was starting with Henry Louis Gates Jr. Um, uh, from Harvard, and they needed an editor, and so I left the New York Times, which was something I thought I would never do. When you arrive at the New York Times, I thought that I would spend the rest of my career there, and 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 we just jumped in the deep end and started this website called The Root, and we we did that in the fall and winter of in the fall and early winter of 2007, and we launched in January of 28 and sorry in 2008. And you know it turned out to be a very good time to launch a website focused on Black news consumers interested in politics, because we launched 2 days after the South Carolina primary, and Barack
mm.
Obama was ascending,
Yeah.
and soon it would become clear that he was the candidate. And so this thing that I thought was going to be a slow learn of how to build a website was just bananas. Like we were working 12, 15-hour days. We had a staff when we started of 3 people, with a website, a proprietary website that was big and clunky and hard to run. I got better over the years, but in that first year, we were it was wild and extremely fun, and we were able to identify new voices, and it was an important time to do that. At the time, there had been those buyouts had started. News was starting to really change. And I think a lot of news organizations realized that they had been reconfigured in such a way that they actually had very few journalists of color and very few women in key roles in a political year that was all about 2 candidates, one of whom was a woman and one of whom was a Black man. And
Mhm.
and the cable news channels were scrambling, looking for voices, people who could talk about things, and we had some really smart writers, and we're carving out a new space where we could take a look at politics from a more commentary angle. I have very mixed feelings about where that has all gone now.
Yeah.
I think that journalism framed by a preponderance of hot takes is not my idea of great journalism. I think we need more reporting and fewer opinions. Um, but at the time, I thought we filled a void in the market. Um,
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that. And first, though, let me ask you about the audience.
mm,
And how do you think over your career the needs and opinions of the audience have changed? You know, I don't know if this is one of those like, is it the chicken or the egg? Is it us, the journalists, or is it the audience? But I mean, you've seen how things have changed. What do you think about how the audience, their perspective, their perception, and their desires for whatever they want has changed?
I think it's been both. I think that in those early days of the web, we made assumptions that things couldn't be over 600 words and people had very short attention spans and they wanted things very quick. And as we see now, actually, people want much deeper, substantive content, things that they can spend time with. But they want it more on their terms. They want to listen when they want to listen or watch. Um, and they want to be able to carve out the bites on their own, rather than be really driven by what is a traditional clock for broadcast. And so I do think that all of our consumption habits have changed, but I think that in journalism, because the business model had changed, and in many cases, news organizations were just scrambling for their survival. And so we looked at trends and ran toward them in many cases without remembering what are our principles and what is our mission? What are we really bound and committed to doing? And so I think many news organizations lost their way. That might not be that may that may not be quite right. I mean, but I think we certainly ran toward whatever shiny penny
Mm.
looked like survival.
Well, do you think? I mean, going back to what you said a little while ago, is that we need more reporting and less opinion. That that's when around that time I think is when you had like every cable channel at that point had news, and you had so many different shows, and all of a sudden a lot of the shows in prime time weren't the news, they were commentators. So
And
do you
and
think that
so
is that the shiny penny? You think that
I think
that
that that is what people thought the shiny penny was, right? It is easier to have someone just express their thoughts than to send people out in the field to do reporting. Um, you know, I'm talking to you here, but really my what I think about things doesn't matter. What matters is and what I think most reporters get into the business is because they are curious about the world, and they're curious about going out and asking people questions and seeing what is happening and reflecting the world back to people
yeah.
in a way that helps them see what is shaping their lives.
Hmm.
Um, and and I think, I mean, honestly, I think the situation that we are in now in the country has all to do with that 15 years of chasing trends that abandoned ultimately
Yeah.
what journalism is supposed to be serving. I mean, you work for a great local news station. Um, But I think if we think about if you take January 6th as uh, as a documentary of the failing of the systems in our country, right? Um, one of those failings is that we allowed local journalism to crumble and disappear. And I am public media stepped in a really valiant uh, way as local newspapers failed. But if you look across the country, I'm based in Michigan, um, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I'm from Ohio. And if you look across the country and you look at where people have to go for their information and the communities with a lack of people on the ground who can simply tell them what's happening in their own neighborhood.
Right.
And if you have a system where journalism is just people on TV from some place that you're not at all connected to,
Hmm.
telling you how the people in this myopic city are doing things that are affecting you. And nobody's telling you about your own zoning board or your own school board or your own police department or your own sheriff's office. You start to have this warped opinion that these information centers are somehow the puppets that are at the root of everything.
Hmm.
And it both lets local communities off the hook for being invested and involved in their own systems and structures, and it weakens all of our systems and structures. And I think, you know we can blame tech companies for that, but I think journalism failed to make a case for why and how it was important in people's lives. And in the past 5 years or so, um, I think journalism has recognized that and has started to reinvest in local news and to try to make the case for what journalists do. But it wasn't until somebody was out loud calling us the enemy and people were beating up journalists at press conferences and news organizations were having to station security guards with their reporters that we started actually becoming very serious about making this case.
It got me thinking about there was a piece in Politico that's where I found you, and they did a piece. It was really interesting. It was is the media doomed, and they
Oh,
talked to
yes.
16 or 17 different people about where's journalism going in the next 15 years, and your I remember reading your take, which was a big focus on local,
I
and
think it
so
has to be local.
the next 15 years, what do you think? How do you think this industry is going to change, or is it that you think it has to change to survive?
I think it has to change to survive. I think it already is starting to. And I think that there are a lot of really impressive local efforts, people doing very deep journalism about things that may never get national attention. I think we have to be all right with that. It doesn't, just because a story doesn't reach the level of being talked about on one of the primetime cable network shows, that can't be the barometer of whether or not a story is important. Um, and I would say this about the New York Times and the Washington Post as well. They have both. I mean, they're both doing tremendous journalism. The LA Times is making a fantastic comeback, and we've got a few regional papers that are holding on. But I think at the community level, at the ground level, thinking about local journalism in a way that is better than it was before, in a way that is more reflective of the diversity of the communities they serve more, in a way that's more focused on accountability and and really looking critically at systems. That's what's going to get us back, I think, get us back. I'm careful about saying back because I don't want to be overly nostalgic about the way things were, but I think it would help us get to a place where people can be functioning, productive citizens because they're
Right.
armed with information.
One of the things, though, a little bit of pushback here is you think about that local, the need for the local. It's going to be easier in, like, say, for example, in communities like mine. So, the station that I work for, the public radio station in South Florida, covers this big area of
Mhm.
from Palm Beach County all the way down to Miami. But it has the resources to do it. And I think that you'll see in bigger cities or bigger metropolitan areas, the resources will be there. But there's still going to be those areas where you have those news deserts where there just isn't the support. How do we overcome that challenge?
It's the business challenge hasn't changed. I think that the hurdle that, why we started running after all of these solutions that turned out to be detrimental was because of a failed business model. Um, and the kind of advertising models that supported local news in the past, that's not really going to come back in a meaningful way. But I don't know that I truly believe that there aren't resources to support journalism.
Do you think, and this is kind of the irony in some ways, that those big tech companies are putting money into some organizations,
They
into
are.
you know they're part of the solution. They could be part of the solution. They're also part of the problem. I don't,
I
this
mean,
is
which has in some ways always been the case,
right.
right? It is not like, I mean, newspapers were lucky if the family that owned them stayed out of the way of the editorial and didn't try to meddle and just supported the reporting. But it has always been the case that people who support journalism, that there's got to be some sort of a wall protecting the journalism from the interests of the people producing the journalism. That has always been the case. And so I think that the tech companies know that they owe something to the system to help. Um, and then journalists have to be who journalists are. We have to be critical. We have to know that if you take $100,000 from Google or Meta to help start or pay for a reporter or two in your local area, you have to enter those agreements with an understanding about what that money does and doesn't do, what it does and doesn't buy, right? And to understand the self-interest of where the money's coming from and really protect the integrity of what the money is going toward.
Yeah.
And I think that they're in the same way that, there are people in every state that can support a symphony or a public library or a theater, that or an art museum, that we have to make the case that those same people, that some of their money needs to go to support journalism. And and then I have to think I think that we have to make the case that reporting costs money.
It does. No, it does. Yeah.
There's just I just don't think that there's a way around it.
Hmm.
I can tell you what I think about something, but until I go do the reporting and dig and find records and talk to people and verify my facts, which takes time. Um, it's just to have good journalism. It it's not something that is best done on the cheap.
That's a very good point. I agree completely. Let me finish with these last two things. I want to come back to something that you said a little while ago, is how journalism is had failed to, I guess, and I'm paraphrasing here. So what you
Hmm.
were talking about, how the messaging to the public, we failed in our messaging to them as to who we are and what we do. I know, and I've heard from a lot of people, and I've always grown up being taught, hey, this isn't a popularity contest. We're not here to be loved. We're here to seek the truth. But at the same time, we do have to try to help people understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, so they don't attack us for it. But what is that messaging? What are we doing wrong? Do we need to go on a PR campaign to help people understand what a journalist is?
I think it's a tricky question. I mean, I think PR campaigns only go so far, because people understand it as PR. They understand it in some respects as spin. And so I think that, I mean, this is one thing that I think the industry is starting to learn from the really fantastic data journalists who have, really become integral to our newsrooms, that it's that old math assignment. You don't get full points unless you show your work. And I think we have to show our work, and we have to explain to people, okay, this is the story we created. How do we do that? Why do we have to talk to people? I did a story recently where it had to do with criminal justice, and I was talking to a family. Someone was in jail, and the woman, was talking to me about arrests, and I just explained. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and look up all the records of the arrests, and I'm going to read the police version of the account of that arrest, and I'm going to compare the two. It doesn't mean I don't believe what you're saying, but for the work to be credible, I have to look at it from a number of different angles.
Hmm.
And I think, to the extent that we can explain to people how we do our work and why we're doing it that way, and to the extent that we can be transparent about when we make mistakes, um, that will get us some way toward having people's trust. And again, this is where I think local is where you build that up, because if there are journalists in a community who are running into the people they're covering at the grocery store and at the dry cleaners and at the coffee shop and at the park, um, then you can have casual conversation. If somebody thinks you did a terrible job on a story, you can have a conversation and say, yeah, I know you may not have liked that, and here's why it was that way. If I'm wrong, tell me why I'm wrong. Okay, maybe we'll go back and look at that in a follow-up to that story. But when you can be face to face with people about about how and why things are done in a certain way, again, I think it makes the reporting stronger, and it may not change everybody's mind, but at least people can see that there's a process to it, and it's not just people sitting somewhere far away making things up. Um,
You got to let them into the kitchen to see how everything is
you
made.
do.
You got to let them in. Maybe that in every few years, we release a movie like Spotlight, and that could help too sometimes. At least with people understanding some of the basics. But it's interesting, and I'll finish with this because the work you're doing right now, you're working with younger journalists. You're catching them at a certain point in their career. But I wondered, from what you're seeing with the younger journalists that are coming up in the business, their approach to this work compared to when you and me were coming up. Is it that
I
different?
think the future is very promising. I think the future is very promising. So I run the Wallace House Center for Journalists at the University of Michigan. We have two programs: the Knight-Wallace Fellowships, which works with with more accomplished journalists. So typically, the people in the fellowship are in their 30s, 40s, sometimes in their 50s. Um, and the Livingston Awards for young journalists awards excellence in journalism by journalists under 35. And so I tend to see journalists sort of in those early years of their career and at the stage in their career where they've had some big accomplishments and are trying to figure out what they're going to do next. Um, but I'm also on a university campus where I see students who are interested in journalism. And I think every year I see so much good journalism and journalists being armed with tools that, you know, I could have never dreamed of knowing how to use when I was sitting with a razor blade and tape in my hand trying to put people's sentences together. Um, they understand, again, I think fundamentally kind of understand this show your work thing, that you can write a paragraph, but if that paragraph is supported better by a great 1 hour radio episode that allows people to hear in more context the why of something, or whether it's better supported by an interactive data visualization that can break down for people how something happened and who it affected, or it can be better explored with a simple numbers chart. And understanding that we talk a lot about the failings of our education system, but I do think one thing in American public education that I feel like I see reflected in journalism now is this concept that people absorb information in a variety of ways, right? There are different kinds of learners. And by the same token, there are different ways to tell a story. And when I was working with teams at NPR and working with multi-platform teams, I would say, let's start with the story and then talk about what is the best platform and way to do that story. When I think in the early days of the web, whatever was your primary medium, you sort of assumed, okay, we're going to do a 3.5 minute radio story. And then you toss that over some invisible fence to the digital people, and they do their digital thing with it. And then they toss it over to the social people, and they do their social thing. And that's not really the best way to approach storytelling. The
Right.
way you communicate a story on social or on a web page or with numbers or with graphics needs to be organic and original to that storytelling platform. And I see the young journalists who are interested in telling stories really thinking about the information and who they're trying to reach and what might be the best way to reach them. And that gives me actually a lot of hope. And I think that we can do PR campaigns, but I think in a very old-fashioned way, the way we protect journalism is by doing more journalism and showing people how we do it, why we do it, why it's important to them, involving them in the process, and realizing that there's a whole country to cover, and that it can't just be Washington and New York and a little bit of Florida and a little bit of California and a little bit of Texas driving what people should do or think or feel or how they should act in the rest of the country.
Yeah. You know what? First of all, I've heard now from a few different people that there's that feeling. There's a lot of promise. I think with the younger generation about their desire to find truth in storytelling, and but I do agree that's true. I always try to instill in them. Life isn't just in on the coast. There's a lot.
It is not.
There's a lot, and I think, excuse me, that my take has always been, and I had the opportunity many years ago to teach journalism. Is I always tried to instill in them like, hey, You know, all the stories, all the news isn't just happening in these centers. I could take a great journalist, a great producer, a great writer, whatever. I could throw you in Juneau, Alaska. I can throw you in Boise, Idaho. I can throw you anywhere, and you're going to find those stories. You're not just waiting. You're not just in the big centers waiting for that. So thank you for mentioning that, because that is very true. Um, I am optimistic too about the future. I know things are. It's a strange world, but I think that's perspective also. I mean, the world's just always changing, and we'll just adapt to it. But Lynette, I really appreciate this conversation and everything. And yeah, thank you for the insight. I really do. And I hope that the listeners also appreciate it as well.
It was a real pleasure, and I'm so glad that you're having these conversations too. Journalism is sometimes unglamorous, but it is never uninteresting. It is never uninteresting because understanding how people live
Right.
and the challenges they face and the things that they're doing to overcome those challenges is never uninteresting. And it is never unimportant, not even in the smallest town in the country. It is never unimportant. And so I think that there are a lot of people who are innately curious who are drawn to journalism because they want to sit and listen to people's stories. Uh, and so I really thank you for trying to illuminate that for people.
Well, thank you for being in the reporter's studio. All right.